The encounter. It was a hot afternoon in Atlanta, the sun blazing down on the bustling streets. The heat was oppressive, but Tarara West, an FBI special agent, hardly noticed. She was lost in her thoughts, still reeling from the intensity of the investigation she had been working on for months. For the last several weeks, she'd been tracking down a dangerous drug ring that had plagued the city for far too long. The hours were long, the pressure relentless, but today she was close, very close to cracking the case wide open. Her mind raced as she reviewed the details one more time. She had spent countless hours gathering intel, connecting the dots, and making dangerous calls to undercover informants. She had come so far. And now, the pieces were finally falling into place. Tarara was proud of her work. It wasn't easy being one of the few black women in a predominantly male-dominated institution. But despite the hurdles, she had made a name for herself. She had earned her respect. The day had been long, and her body felt heavy with exhaustion. She couldn't remember the last time she had gotten a full night's sleep, but that didn't matter. She was about to make a breakthrough, and that was enough to keep her going. As she drove down the familiar streets, the hum of the car's engine and the rhythmic ticking of the turn signal were the only sounds she could focus on. She couldn't help but replay the latest piece of information she had gathered in her mind. A tip had come through just before she left the office, a key piece of evidence that could lead her to the head of the drug ring. She was close, very close. Tarara's thoughts were interrupted when she noticed something in her rearview mirror. Her eyes flicked to the flashing blue and red lights behind her. The sound of sirens cut through the otherwise quiet afternoon. A police officer was pulling her over. She wasn't speeding, and her driving was steady. There was no reason for this. Still, she remained calm, pulling her car to the side of the road. The officer's car came to a stop behind her, and the door swung open. A tall, serious-looking white officer stepped out and walked toward her vehicle. His uniform was crisp, and his steps were deliberate, his face hard and unreadable. Tarara didn't feel fear, but she did feel a deep, uneasy tension in the air. There was something about this situation that felt off, and it gnawed at her. She took a deep breath and prepared herself. Her hand instinctively reached for her FBI badge, which she kept close by in her bag. She wasn't going to make a scene. She would handle this the way she always handled challenges, with calm professionalism. But something told her this wasn't going to be just another routine traffic stop. The officer reached her car and paused for a moment before slowly approaching her window. His hand rested on the holster of his gun, and his eyes never left her face. She rolled the window down, maintaining a neutral expression, even as she wondered what could have gone wrong. The last thing she needed today was a confrontation with a random cop. "Good afternoon, officer," she greeted, keeping her tone polite and steady. "Is there a problem?" The officer's gaze was sharp and cold. His name tag read Officer Daniels, but he barely looked at it. His eyes flicked quickly to her license and registration, then back to her face. "I said license and registration," he barked, his voice clipped and demanding. There was no greeting, no recognition of her calm demeanor, just a harsh, almost hostile tone. Tarara was taken aback by his abruptness. She had dealt with difficult cops before, but this was different. Officer Daniels wasn't just indifferent, he was hostile, with a cold contempt in his eyes that she hadn't experienced in years. She glanced at his hand still hovering near his gun, her body tensing slightly. Something wasn't right. She had been stopped by plenty of officers in her time. But this man made her feel like she was a suspect, not an FBI agent. "I'm an FBI agent," she said, reaching for her badge with steady hands. "Agent Tarara West." She held it up, offering it to him as she always had in these situations, expecting a routine response. She wasn't trying to escalate things, but she also wasn't going to tolerate disrespect. Officer Daniels took the badge from her with a brief glance. He didn't seem impressed. In fact, he barely looked at it at all. His eyes flicked back to her face, then quickly back to her car. He didn't acknowledge her status or her identity in any way. Instead, he simply grunted and tossed the badge back toward her. I said, "License and registration," he repeated, his voice sharper this time. Tarara's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe it. He wasn't even going to acknowledge the badge. He wasn't going to give her the respect she deserved as an agent, as a professional, as a person. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, trying to keep her composure. She could feel the weight of his dismissive attitude pressing down on her. It was clear he wasn't going to back down, but she also wasn't going to let him get away with disrespecting her, not without a fight. This wasn't just about her being a woman or being black. It was about him showing a blatant disregard for authority. And she wasn't going to let that stand. "I've given you my badge, Officer Daniels," Tarara said slowly, her voice calm but firm. "Now, I'll give you my registration." She reached into the glove compartment, her movements deliberate. She wasn't going to let him push her around, but she wasn't going to escalate things either. She was trained for moments like this, trained to de-escalate when she could. But she was also trained to stand her ground when necessary. But as her fingers touched the registration, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just a routine stop. Officer Daniels wasn't acting like a cop who had made a mistake or who was simply doing his job. There was something personal about his demeanor, something cruel in the way he was treating her, as if he was making a statement, as if he wanted to remind her of her place. When she handed him the documents, his eyes never met hers again. He took them with a stiff hand and didn't bother to say thank you or acknowledge her professionalism. He simply turned and walked back to his patrol car, his posture rigid, his movements cold. Tarara sat in her car stunned. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she forced herself to take deep breaths. She couldn't understand what had just happened. She had been stopped before, but never like this. Never with this kind of cold, unfeeling contempt. It was clear that this officer had no respect for her badge, or for her work. And that made her furious. As she sat there, the weight of the situation began to settle in. Something told her this wasn't just an isolated incident. Officer Daniels had singled her out. He had chosen to treat her differently, not just because she was a woman, not just because she was black, but because of something deeper, something she couldn't quite put her finger on yet. She took one more deep breath, looking around to steady herself. There were plenty of things she could do next. She could report the officer, escalate things to his superiors, but something inside of her told her that she wasn't done here yet, not by a long shot. As she waited for him to return, she prepared herself for whatever was coming next. She knew this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was going to be something more, much more. And whatever it was, Tarara was ready. The confrontation. The hot sun blazed down on the asphalt, the air heavy with humidity as Tarara sat in her car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. Officer Daniels had walked away without saying a word, leaving her in an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Her mind was racing, each thought bouncing off the other, trying to make sense of the situation. She had been pulled over countless times before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a random traffic stop. There was something about the way Officer Daniels had treated her, something personal, something unsettling that made her feel like more than just an FBI agent, like she was a target. The heat was unbearable, but Tarara barely noticed. The anger simmering inside of her was far hotter than the summer afternoon. She had faced prejudice and discrimination before, but this felt like a deliberate attempt to undermine her, to remind her of her place. She wasn't just another black woman on the street. She was an FBI agent, a highly trained professional with years of experience. And yet, this officer had treated her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience, a second-class citizen. She watched as Officer Daniels sat in his patrol car, his posture stiff and unrelenting as he flipped through the documents she had handed him. He hadn't even bothered to look her in the eye. No respect. No acknowledgement of her authority. Just the cold, indifferent dismissal that stung deeper than she was willing to admit. But Tarara wasn't going to let him get away with it. She had worked too hard to get where she was, fought too many battles, internally and externally, to let some small-minded cop with a badge make her feel less than. Her heart pounded in her chest, not out of fear, but out of a growing sense of injustice. She had faced adversity her whole life, but she'd always risen above it, and this would be no different. Her instincts screamed at her to report Officer Daniels, to escalate the situation. She could call her superiors, explain the blatant disrespect she had just encountered, and let the chips fall where they may. But something inside her told her that this moment was bigger than just a single cop's prejudice. This was about standing up for herself, and for all the other women and people of color who had been made to feel small, made to feel like they didn't matter. And so, Terrera made a decision. She would wait. She would let Officer Daniels return. And when he did, she would face him with the same calm professionalism she had always prided herself on. But this time, it wouldn't be just about following procedure. It would be about asserting her place in the world, asserting her right to be treated with dignity and respect. Minutes ticked by as she sat in the car, the tension in her chest mounting with every passing second. She kept telling herself to stay calm, to breathe, but it was hard. Her mind kept replaying the way he had dismissed her so casually, the way he had refused to acknowledge her badge or her status. It wasn't just that he hadn't respected her. It was that he had done so with a sense of entitlement, like he had the right to look down on her. The anger inside of her bubbled over, but she didn't let it show. She would not let him provoke her. Not today. Not in this moment. She would be the calm in the storm, the one who controlled the narrative. She would make sure that when he returned, he would understand exactly who he was dealing with. Finally, the officer's car door swung open, and Officer Daniels stepped out, walking toward her car with the same rigid posture he had maintained earlier. His eyes were cold and unfeeling, but there was something else in his demeanor now, something that told her he was either annoyed or frustrated. Perhaps it was the realization that his little power play hadn't had the intended effect. As he approached, Terrera took a deep breath. She wasn't going to let her emotions control her actions. She would stand her ground, but she would do so with grace. She had learned long ago that the best way to disarm a hostile situation was with calm confidence, with a quiet strength that made others rethink their choices. Officer Daniels didn't waste any time. "You're free to go," he said abruptly, handing her back the documents without a word of apology. His tone was condescending, as though he was doing her a favor. He clearly thought that just because he had the badge, he held all the power in the situation. Terrera didn't take the documents immediately. She looked at him for a moment, letting the silence hang in the air. Then she spoke, her voice steady and measured. "I don't appreciate how you treated me back there," she said, her words deliberate. "I'm an FBI agent, and I deserve the same respect as any other law enforcement officer, whether I'm on duty or not." Officer Daniels shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't respond right away. The silence stretched out between them, thick and awkward. Terrera could feel the weight of his discomfort. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. He was used to being the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of the interaction. But not today. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Terrera continued, her voice firm. "I'm asking for basic decency. I showed you my badge, and you didn't even bother to acknowledge it. You didn't even look me in the eye. And that's not acceptable." Officer Daniels took a step back, his jaw tightening as if he were trying to keep his temper in check. "I don't know who you think you are," he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. Terrera stood her ground. "I think I'm someone who deserves respect. And if you can't give me that, then we have a bigger problem than just this traffic stop." The officer's face flushed with anger. He clearly wasn't used to being spoken to like this, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. But Terrera didn't care about his ego. She cared about standing up for herself, standing up for every woman and person of color who had been belittled or dismissed by people like him. "You're dismissed, officer," Terrera said, her tone cold and unwavering. She didn't need to say anything else. She had made her point. She turned to start her car, her fingers slipping into place on the wheel. But just as she was about to pull away, she heard the officer's voice again, this time louder and angrier. "You better watch your back, lady. I won't forget this." Tarara's grip on the wheel tightened, but she didn't turn back. She didn't need to respond to his threats. She knew this wasn't over. But she also knew that she had taken a stand today. She had asserted her rights, and she wasn't going to let him or anyone else forget that. As she drove away, the weight of the encounter still hung in the air. But Tarara knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the last time she would cross paths with Officer Daniels. And next time, things would be different. The hidden truth. The days that followed the confrontation with Officer Daniels were filled with a mix of tension and relief. Tarara West had never been one to back down, but after the encounter on the side of the road, something had shifted inside her. The city of Atlanta felt different now, like a silent war had begun between her and the officer who had so casually dismissed her, and she wasn't sure whether she was ready for the fallout. Still, she kept her head down, focusing on her work. The investigation into the drug ring that had consumed her life for the past few months had reached a critical point. But as she sat in her office, the files in front of her seemed less important. Her mind kept drifting back to the traffic stop. The officer's words echoed in her mind, like a warning she couldn't ignore. "You better watch your back, lady. I won't forget this." Tarara had heard threats before. As an FBI agent, she had been exposed to danger and hostility more times than she cared to count. But something about Officer Daniels felt different. His words, the icy hostility in his eyes, and the disregard for her authority. It all pointed to something deeper, something personal. The problem was, Tarara had no idea what that something was. For the next few days, she maintained a strict focus on the case, spending long hours in the office, tracking leads, and coordinating with other agencies. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Officer Daniels standing there, dismissing her with a flick of his wrist, a sneer that made her blood boil. That afternoon, as she was going through her case files at her desk, a knock on her office door pulled her back to reality. She looked up, momentarily startled, but then saw a familiar face. Her partner, Derek Daniels, no relation to Officer Daniels, she was sure of it, stood in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a file in the other. "You look like you could use a break," Derek said, flashing a knowing smile. He was a tall, lean man with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of humor. He had been with Tarara through some of the toughest cases, and though they had their differences, they worked well together. They had a mutual respect that went beyond their professional relationship. Tarara took a deep breath and nodded. "I could use something stronger than coffee," she said, accepting the cup. "What's up?" Derek sat down across from her, flipping open the file he was holding. "I thought you might want to take a look at this." He placed the file in front of her. "It's from our source inside the city's criminal network. Seems like we got a bigger player in this drug ring than we originally thought." Tarara skimmed through the file, her mind still preoccupied with the events of the past few days. The case was important, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a connection between Officer Daniels and this investigation. She was certain of it, but she didn't have the pieces to put it all together. "I'll look into it later," Tarara said distractedly, pushing the file aside. "Right now, I need to get to the bottom of something else." Derek raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Everything okay?" Tarara hesitated for a moment before meeting his gaze. She wasn't the type to let her emotions get the best of her, but there was something about Officer Daniels that unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. "I don't know. There's something about this officer I've been dealing with, Derek. I've never felt like this before, not from a cop. It's like he's got it out for me for some reason, and I can't figure out why." Derek's expression softened, and he nodded slowly. "You've been through a lot, Tarara. We all have our moments of doubt. But if you're getting that feeling, it's probably for a reason." Tarara looked at her partner, the weight of her suspicions pressing down on her. "I've worked with law enforcement for years, Derek. I know the signs. He's not just any officer. He's hiding something, and I need to find out what it is." The unraveling. The fluorescent lights above hummed quietly as Terrera followed the young officer down the narrow hall of the precinct. The building was old, with chipped paint on the walls and creaky wooden floors that betrayed the weight of countless footsteps. It wasn't a place that felt welcoming, but Terrera didn't mind the atmosphere. She was used to uncomfortable situations, but the tension she felt now was different. This was no longer about the case at hand. It was about a deeper investigation, one that went beyond the surface. The officer led her to a small conference room at the back of the precinct. "Officer Daniels isn't here, but you can speak to Lieutenant Harris," he said before leaving her at the door. Terrera nodded, trying to suppress the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. Lieutenant Harris was a senior officer at the precinct, a man whose reputation for being fair and level-headed was well known. If anyone could help her get to the bottom of what was going on with Officer Daniels, it would be Harris, but something told her that the truth wouldn't come easily. She took a deep breath, straightening her jacket as she stepped into the room. Lieutenant Harris was seated at a desk, shuffling papers. He looked up as she entered, his face a mask of professional indifference. He was a tall man with graying hair and a weathered face, his uniform pressed and clean. His eyes were sharp, but there was an air of weariness about him, as though he had seen it all, and wasn't always pleased by what he had witnessed. "Agent West," he said, his voice low but cordial. "What brings you down here today?" Terrera took a seat across from him, her heart thumping in her chest. She needed to be careful with her words. She wasn't here to accuse Officer Daniels outright. Not yet. But she knew she couldn't keep skating around the truth. "I'm here about Officer Daniels," Terrera said, choosing her words with care. "There was an incident recently that left me with some concerns. I'd like to ask you a few questions about him, if you don't mind." Lieutenant Harris raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything at first. Instead, he steepled his fingers and leaned back in his chair. "What sort of concerns, Agent West?" Terrera hesitated for a moment before answering. "I had an encounter with Officer Daniels during a traffic stop. The way he treated me was unprofessional, to say the least. He refused to acknowledge my badge, treated me with disdain, and acted as though I wasn't even a fellow officer. I need to know if this is typical behavior for him." Harris' expression didn't change, but Terrera noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. He was listening, but there was a guarded quality to his demeanor. He wasn't rushing to defend Daniels, but he wasn't showing his hand either. "I see," Harris said after a beat. "And you're certain this wasn't just a misunderstanding?" "Officer Daniels is known to be a bit blunt at times." Terrera shook her head firmly. "It wasn't just bluntness. It was something else. Something personal. He didn't just treat me like a fellow officer. He treated me like I didn't belong here. Like I was beneath him." Harris didn't respond immediately, and Terrera watched as he absorbed her words. She could sense he was calculating, weighing whether or not to say anything further. She wasn't sure if it was because he was protecting Daniels, or if he truly didn't know the full extent of what was going on. After a few moments, Harris finally spoke. "I'm going to be honest with you, Agent West. I don't know the full story behind Officer Daniels' actions, but I do know that he's difficult to work with. He's always been a bit of a lone wolf. Some people respect him for it. Others think he's a bit too eager to prove himself. It's possible his personal views are bleeding into his professional conduct." Terrera's brow furrowed. "Personal views. Let's just say he's not the most progressive thinker when it comes to working with people outside his circle," Harris replied, his tone dropping slightly as though he didn't want to say too much. "He's had issues in the past. Nothing that's ever resulted in formal complaints, but there have been whispers. It's not something I'd want to make public, but it's not a secret either." Terrera's mind raced. This was the first real clue she had gotten. Officer Daniels wasn't just a road cop. He had a history, a track record of problems that hadn't been addressed properly. Harris had just confirmed what she had suspected all along. Officer Daniels was someone with deep-rooted issues, and if she wasn't careful, those issues could spill over into her own career. "Are you telling me that you've allowed a man with these views to work as a police officer?" Tarara asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Isn't it your responsibility to address this kind of behavior?" Harris sighed, his gaze dropping to the desk as if he were avoiding her eyes. "It's complicated, Agent West. Daniels has been here a long time. He's had his moments of brilliance, and he's put in his time. But yes, I know he has his shortcomings. I've tried to talk to him about it, but he's not someone who listens to advice easily. Some things just don't change." Tarara clenched her fists, frustration boiling inside her. This isn't just about an officer's behavior. This is about systemic issues. If you've been turning a blind eye to this kind of attitude, then you're complicit. This is a problem that goes beyond Daniels. It's a culture. Harris looked up at her then, his eyes hardening. "I'm not denying that there are issues within the department, but you have to understand, Agent West, the police force isn't just a machine that you can fix with a few simple adjustments. It's a system, deeply ingrained in how this city operates. You can't just come in and change it all overnight. And if you start stirring up too much trouble, there are people who will come after you." Tarara's heart skipped a beat at his words. The weight of what he was saying hit her all at once. This wasn't just about Officer Daniels. This was about the entire system, the forces that protected him, that allowed him to act the way he did without fear of repercussions. It was bigger than she had imagined. "I understand your position, Lieutenant," Tarara said, her voice steady despite the rising tide of anger. "But this isn't about convenience or politics. This is about doing what's right. If there's a cancer in this department, it needs to be cut out before it spreads." For a moment, Harris didn't reply. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "You're a good agent, Agent West. But you need to be careful. You've got your work cut out for you. You start digging into Officer Daniels, and you might not like what you find. There are some things you can't unearth." Tarara leaned forward, her voice low but unwavering. "I'm not afraid of the truth, Lieutenant. And if you won't do something about Officer Daniels, then I will." Harris's eyes softened for a brief moment, but there was something else there too. Regret, maybe. He was a man caught between his duty to protect the department and the reality of its problems. "Just remember, Agent West," he said quietly, "you've got a lot of enemies now. But I'll keep my ear to the ground for you. Just be careful where you tread next." Tarara nodded, standing up. "I will. Thank you, Lieutenant." As she walked out of the room, she felt the weight of the conversation settle over her like a cloak. She was entering dangerous territory, but there was no turning back now. The system had to be confronted, and if it meant taking down Officer Daniels, and possibly more, then so be it. The next steps were clear. She would continue her investigation into Officer Daniels, but she would also need to prepare herself for the war that was about to unfold. The reckoning. The morning after her conversation with Lieutenant Harris, Tarara West woke up with a sense of resolve that was more powerful than anything she'd felt in a long time. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but she knew there was no turning back. She had faced opposition before, had even encountered enemies within her own agency, but nothing had ever felt quite as personal as this. Officer Daniels wasn't just any cop. He was a man whose prejudice ran deep, so deep that he couldn't even hide his disdain for her right in front of her badge, in front of the very work she had dedicated her life to. But now, Tarara had more than just the sting of his words to fuel her. She had the truth. Harris had confirmed what she'd suspected all along. Officer Daniels wasn't just acting out of ego or frustration. There were systemic issues at play. Daniels wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a larger problem, a culture of toxic attitudes that had been allowed to fester within the precinct. And that, Terrera realized was the heart of the matter. If she could take down Daniels, expose the corruption within the precinct, she could start to make a difference, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been pushed aside, dismissed, and disregarded. But first, she needed evidence, the kind that would stand up in court, the kind that would force change, no matter how uncomfortable it made those in power. She spent the next several hours meticulously going through her case files again, her mind in overdrive. Every piece of information she had gathered in her investigation into the drug ring now seemed like a tool, a stepping stone in her larger mission. As she read through the details of the case, it became clear that Daniels's behavior wasn't just a personal vendetta against her. It was part of a much larger issue that needed to be exposed. And as fate would have it, the case she was already working on had a connection to Daniels's department. Terrera's phone rang, breaking her concentration. She glanced at the caller ID. Derek. She didn't hesitate to pick up. Terrera. Derek's voice was urgent, his tone filled with quiet alarm. I just got word that Daniels is involved in a bigger mess than we thought. It's not just his attitude we need to worry about. There are reports coming through that he's been tied to some shady operations, things that go way beyond a bad temper. Terrera's heart skipped a beat. What kind of operations? Illegal weapons trade, Derek said, lowering his voice, and some serious connections with local gangs. I don't have all the details, but I'm digging through some old reports. If you're right about him being connected to this larger system, then we might be able to bring him down for good. Terrera's mind raced as she processed the new information. She had suspected that Officer Daniels's behavior wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was part of something much more dangerous. If Daniels was involved in criminal activity beyond the precinct, that opened up a whole new can of worms. She didn't have all the details yet, but she knew this was the break she'd been waiting for. I need everything you can get on him, Derek, Terrera said, her voice firm. Whatever you dig up, make sure it's airtight. We need to get ahead of this before he gets wind of what's coming. If he's involved in criminal activity like you're saying, this isn't just about me anymore. It's about taking down a corrupt system. Derek's voice softened, but the determination in it was clear. You've got it. I'll send everything I find to your secure email as soon as I can. Just be careful, Terrera. This is going to be bigger than we thought. She hung up the phone, her pulse quickening. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something monumental. This wasn't just about Daniels anymore. If what Derek was saying was true, this could have far-reaching consequences, not only for Daniels but for the entire precinct. There were dirty cops everywhere, those who bent the rules, who used their badge as a shield to get away with anything, and who knew how to cover their tracks. And now, it seemed Daniels was at the center of it all. But that only meant one thing for Terrera. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to confront him. She had to do it now, while she still had the upper hand. Hours later, Terrera found herself standing in front of the precinct once more, her mind racing as she stared up at the building. It felt like the eye of the storm. The truth was within her reach, but she knew better than anyone that it wouldn't be handed to her. She would have to fight for it, and she would have to be strategic. If Officer Daniels had any sense of self-preservation, he would know what was coming. She couldn't afford to make a move until she had the concrete evidence she needed. Terrera took a deep breath, then walked inside. The precinct was quieter than it had been during her previous visit. Most of the officers were either on patrol or in meetings. The building felt like it was holding its breath, as though everyone knew something was about to shift, but no one knew exactly what. As she walked through the corridors, she couldn't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The same building, the same cold walls, the same hidden truths lurking beneath the surface. It was all too familiar, but it was different now. She wasn't here as just another agent. She was here to uncover a corruption that ran deeper than any of them realized. Terrera made her way to Officer Daniels's desk, her steps steady but purposeful. She knew the risks. If Daniels was the kind of man she thought he was, he would take it all personally. But that was exactly why she had to do this. She wasn't going to let him push her around anymore. She wasn't going to let him keep using his badge to shield himself from the consequences of his actions. When she reached his desk, she stood for a moment, staring at the cluttered surface. His desk was a mess, papers strewn everywhere, files half open, empty coffee cups scattered around. It seemed so out of place for someone who had managed to make his way up in the department. But there it was. In the chaos of it all, there had to be something. She started rifling through his files, looking for any hint of the evidence Derek had mentioned. Minutes passed, and Tarara's eyes scanned over the documents in front of her. Most of it was mundane. Incident reports, routine paperwork, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, her eyes landed on something that made her stomach drop. A single folder, hidden beneath a stack of reports, labeled only with a series of cryptic numbers. No names, no description. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked it up. This was it. This was the clue she had been searching for. Opening the folder carefully, she saw what she had feared: the connection between Daniels and an illicit weapons operation. There were photos of weapon shipments, dates, locations, and names she didn't recognize. But then, her heart nearly stopped when she saw the name of a known crime syndicate in the city, the very one she had been tracking down in her own investigation. The same gang that had been at the heart of the drug ring. It all clicked. Officer Daniels wasn't just a rogue cop. He was an integral part of a network of corruption that had stretched far beyond the precinct. The evidence was right in front of her, clear and undeniable. But as Tarara quickly closed the folder and tucked it under her arm, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Her heart raced. She had no time to waste. The final showdown. The footsteps grew louder, each step reverberating through the hall, a stark contrast to the quiet chaos that churned inside Tarara's chest. She wasn't sure how much longer she could remain in Officer Daniels' office. Every second felt like an eternity, and the weight of the folder hidden under her arm felt heavier with every passing moment. She knew that the evidence inside could bring him down, expose him for the criminal he truly was. But time was running out, and so was her chance to leave unnoticed. Her heart raced, and her pulse quickened. She glanced around the room, her mind racing to formulate a plan. She couldn't afford to be caught here. Not now. Not after everything she had worked for. If Daniels discovered she had been snooping through his files, it would be over. He was dangerous. His threats, his behavior, they weren't just empty words. He had a history of using his position to manipulate people, and Tarara knew firsthand what it was like to become the target of someone like him. The door creaked open behind her, and Tarara's breath caught in her throat. She froze. For a split second, she thought she might be caught. But then, she heard the voice that made her relax, albeit just a little. Agent West. She turned quickly to find Derek standing in the doorway, his expression tense but relieved at the sight of her. His presence was a welcome distraction, but also a reminder that things were moving too fast. He must have followed her to the precinct, sensing something was wrong, or maybe he had just been keeping an eye on her, as he always did. "What are you doing here?" she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. Derek didn't hesitate, glancing over his shoulder as though checking for anyone else. "I couldn't sit around waiting anymore. We got a small window. I've been digging into Daniels' financials, his phone records. There's too much to ignore. He's not just tied to the drug ring. There are other connections, bigger players, political ties, people he's been working with for years." Tarara's heart skipped. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made her blood run cold. Officer Daniels wasn't just a bad cop. He was part of an entrenched network that extended far beyond the precinct. But this was the moment of truth. If they didn't act now, they might never get another chance. Derek's voice dropped to a whisper, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door. "We've got to go, Tarara. There's no time to waste." She nodded, but as she made to leave, she froze. The folder. She couldn't leave without it. This was the leverage she needed, the undeniable evidence that could tear everything down. Without it, the case would fall apart. Tarara quickly stuffed the folder deeper into her jacket, feeling the sharp edges of the pages press into her side. It felt like carrying a bomb. She was on the brink of something huge, something that could change the course of her life and the lives of countless others who had been wronged by the system. But it wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about taking a stand, not only for herself, but for the integrity of the institution she had dedicated her life to. "Tarara, we don't have time," Derek urged, his voice anxious. "Give me a minute," she responded, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "I need to make sure we're not leaving anything behind." Her eyes darted around the office, her mind working quickly. She grabbed a pen from the desk and scribbled a note on a small piece of paper. It was a simple message, just a few words, but it was enough to send a powerful statement. The truth will always come to light. It was a message for Daniels, a warning, a reminder that even in a system as broken as this one, there were still people who would fight for what was right, who would never allow corruption to thrive unchecked. She slipped the note under the edge of his desk, her heart racing with adrenaline. There was no turning back now. She had done everything she could to prepare, and now it was time to act. "We need to get out of here," Derek said again, more urgently this time. He could walk in at any moment. Tarara's gaze flicked to the door one last time. The precinct was quiet, but the quiet was unsettling. There were too many unknowns, too many moving parts. But one thing was certain. This moment was the beginning of something big. "Let's go," Tarara said, turning toward the door. She knew that once she stepped out of this office, there would be no turning back. Officer Daniels would know who was responsible for digging up his secrets, and he would come after her. But she was ready. She had no other choice. They moved quickly through the hallways, their footsteps almost silent as they navigated the winding corridors of the precinct. Derek kept his head low, but Tarara's senses were on high alert. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every sound like a warning. She could feel the weight of the folder against her ribs, but she forced herself to ignore it. The case wasn't over yet, and neither was her fight. Just as they neared the exit, Tarara's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A message from Lieutenant Harris. "You're playing a dangerous game, Agent West. Watch your back. They know." Her stomach twisted as she read the message. Harris had known. He had been watching, waiting, and now the game was changing. Daniels wouldn't let this go. But neither would she. There was too much at stake. "Derek," she said quickly, her voice tight with urgency, "we need to move. Now." He nodded in understanding, his face hardening with the knowledge of what was to come. As they pushed through the door and into the parking lot, the world outside felt surreal, almost too quiet. The city seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the storm that was coming. But Tarara wasn't afraid. She had walked into the lion's den before, and she had survived. And she would survive again. Once they were safely in the car, Tarara turned to Derek, her eyes hard with determination. "We can't stop now. We take the evidence straight to the Bureau. Daniels is just the beginning. This goes deeper than we ever thought." Derek gave a nod of agreement, his jaw set. "We'll take him down, Tarara. You've got everything we need. We got this." Tarara took a deep breath, staring ahead into the bright Atlanta skyline. The fight wasn't over, but the next steps were clear. She had the evidence. She had the truth. And now, it was time to see it through, no matter what. The storm was coming, but so was the reckoning. And Tarara West wasn't backing down.